Thanks to everybody for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are across the country. It's Margaret Dixon speaking from TIDES Canada, and we have had the privilege of working in shared spaces and co-locations and having a number of projects who are in social purpose real estate across the country and have been exposed in a number of ways to these concepts, and so are very interested in trying to determine how we can build the capacity around shared spaces and social purpose real estate throughout Canada. And so we've taken an opportunity over the last many months to work with a consultant and nonprofit centers network and others to do a scan across the country. And we're very pleased that you're able to join us today to delve into this issue. So joining us are Lori-Ann Girvan, who's the consultant we've worked with over the last many months, and most of you have had the opportunity to meet with or at least talk to in doing this cross-Canada scan. And Sarah Eisinger and Laura Yakubuski are also joining us from the Nonprofit Centers Network, and they will introduce themselves a little bit later on. So with no further ado, I will turn it over so that we can get started on the conversation today, which we hope you will all participate in. Please don't keep your ideas and comments to yourselves. We're really looking to elicit your opinions and responses to the work that Lori-Ann has already done and your great ideas for how we can move this work forward. So please be really active on the chat. We'll record all of the information and look forward to compiling it for you.
Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Eisinger, the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Centers Network. I wanted to just take a moment to welcome all of the NCN members who are on this special webinar today. NCN is delighted to host this webinar and to welcome our Canadian colleagues, Margaret Dixon from TIDES Canada and Lori-Ann Girvan, a consultant to TIDES Canada. As a reminder, NCN offers free monthly webinars to our members, along with access to our online resource center, which holds sample leases, templates, and policies, and a host of other peer-sourced resources for you to use at your center. Members also are receiving a discount at all of our in-person gatherings, like our upcoming Building Opportunities 2015 conference, which will be held in Vancouver. If you're not currently a member, this is a great time to join us to enjoy substantial savings at registration for the conference. I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about the conference. We are delighted to be co-presenting our biannual conference with the Social Purpose Real Estate Collaborative, a public-private funder collaborative table in Vancouver. This will be the first time that NCN has held our international conference in Canada, so it's a very exciting time for us. We've announced our keynote speaker, Dr. Avi Friedman, who's from McGill University, and in addition to more than 40 conference session workshops, we've developed 2 informative site tours. We will conduct 2 concurrent boot camp sessions, and we're planning a great networking party at the Museum of Vancouver. It's going to be a really busy, informative, and fun 3 days in Vancouver, and we hope to see you there and to continue this conversation. I also want to tell you about another upcoming event that we'll be having shortly. It's our monthly webinar series. Our next one in the series is called Measuring Success in Shared Spaces. It's on Thursday, March 26th, and it's going to be on evaluation strategies. You can learn, it's free to members, and you can learn more about it on our website and sign up there. Finally, I want to share with you that we are updating our State of the Sector survey. Some of you might feel like you're participating in a lot of activities around shared spaces, and we hope you can add one more piece to your docket. We are updating a refreshing of data that we collected in 2011, and we'll be sharing the results in Vancouver, and we hope you can participate. We have a quick turnaround. We already have more than 150 respondents to this survey across North America, and we would like your participation as well. If you have the chance, write down this SurveyMonkey link, and we would be happy to have you participate and have your center included in our data. If you have any questions, we can answer them for you. Then I want to tell you a little bit about comments from you. As Margaret said, we're very eager to have your participation in this. You can use the dashboard on the upper right-hand side of your screen. For today, only our speakers will be audible, but we're encouraging you to participate at key points by using the dashboard. We'll be able to offer comments that go just to the panelists or to the whole audience. If you're comfortable, it'd be great if they could go to the entire audience so we can all be a part of this virtual conversation. I'd now like to hand it back over to Margaret.
Thanks, Sarah. These are very collaborative events. Can't do these kinds of things without lots of people being involved. So a big thank you again to the many people from coast to coast in Canada, coast to coast to coast in Canada, who are participating today. And a shout out as well to the United Way of Toronto, who provided part of the funding for the work that Larry-Ann conducted for us over the past many months. And also, obviously, the nonprofit centers who organized this facility for us today and has been a really important partner in helping us look at how we might expand this work across Canada. So thanks to everybody for their participation, and thanks in advance for your continued engagement as we work towards the conference in June and beyond.
Oh, I may have lost the... Okay, Sarah, it looks like I lost the
Okay.
the control.
I'm going to try you one more time.
So, well, welcome everybody.
You should have it.
With a wee bit of a glitch. So, I was particularly excited to do this scan, and when Tide asked me, I absolutely dove in. 10 years ago to the month, I was wrapping up my master's thesis at McGill. I actually wrote about shared spaces, of course. Space making is place making was my groovy thesis title. And at the same time, I was helping a group here put together a very initial funding proposal for the pre-development of a nonprofit co-location in Montreal. And at that time, there were really only a handful of shared space initiatives to point to. They were small in number, but still mighty. And there were really absolutely no takers for the proposal. So what a difference a decade makes. It was incredibly amazing to see all of the activity happening on the ground in my adopted home here of Canada. Sarah, if you could switch to the next slide.
Sure.
Great. And apologies, everybody. So we started with two overarching questions. What is happening in the field of shared spaces? And an important point here, I did let people in networks guide me, so I did not define a particular type of shared space. And precisely because people are grappling with all types of space needs, the conversation itself was rarely limited to shared spaces. So this then led to a reframing of the second question, how best can learning on shared spaces and social purpose real estate be nurtured and scaled? And here you'll see we did use the broader framing of social purpose real estate. And ultimately the aspiration behind this scan is that we have a lot more learning and practice when I come back and chat with you again in 10 years, so for the next decade. So what is social purpose real estate? Here is the definition that the Social Purpose Real Estate Collaborative in Vancouver put together. And every once in a while, someone coins a term that just nails it. This has been an aha moment of, this is what I do. So thanks to Margaret and her peers on the SPREE Collaborative, the Social Purpose Real Estate Collaborative, who named this field so aptly. I just have to say that I only need to figure out the role of the tongue acronym in French. It doesn't quite sing as well in French. And just a note that the image behind this slide is a hotel and Aboriginal art gallery developed and operated by the Vancouver Native Housing Society. And this is a great example of a different kind of SPREE project, not necessarily a shared space, and I would urge you to visit it if you come to Vancouver for the Building Opportunities Conference. So here is the interactive part, and I recognize that we may be trying to do the impossible here. We're trying to create an interactive conversation using a one-way webinar platform. But we do really want to hear from you. And so we're going to highlight questions and responses live time on the webinar and capture them and post them in a public Google Doc that we'll share and post after the webinar. And we're giving the questions at the beginning of each section of the presentation so that as I'm talking, you can actually start putting in your responses. So the first question, I'll be moving into a bit of a summary of what I saw in Canada. So who else should we know about? We want to make sure that we capture any interesting SPREE project that's out there, and who else should we reach out to? And so hopefully I'll start to see some people typing questions in as we're chatting. Sarah, if we could go to the next one. Great. So while you're putting your responses into the question box, please, I'm briefly going to summarize the shared space field, particularly here in Canada. I identified nearly 200 coast to coast, and I have to say I wasn't expecting that number. And it's funny, you realize how big Canada is when you're trying to size an image like this and make sure you get all the dots. So you'll see we have 2 dots from end to end. Couple of caveats. The map is misleading because there are actually dots under dots. Most large cities have multiple initiatives. And the scan definitely did privilege urban areas, and so I know there's much more out there. So again, we definitely want to hear from you. And there's also more exciting projects coming online every day. While I was at one shared space initiative here in Montreal called Notman House, I met the very inspiring co-founders of Centre Magnétique, and this is a proposed co-working and incubation space that's underway to help rebuild the downtown of Lac Mégantic. So again, some really exciting things going on out there. It's a very live and dynamic field, and we want to keep trying to document that. So why is this field burgeoning? There are many tangible benefits. Sarah, if you could move the slide. And I've captured some here. Again, the webinar today is not a how-to or in-depth documentation of shared spaces. We really are focused on thinking about creating a learning community. Here are some of the benefits, and a shout out to NCN's Measuring Collaboration Survey, as well as the frameworks used by peers like Center for Social Innovation, the Hubs, Artscape. These are all key to moving beyond anecdote to some rigor. And as background on this slide, I've included here the wonderful drawing from 401 Richmond's homepage. It sort of is a visual presentation of a lot of these benefits, and when you see it full on, it gives you a sense of the energy of what a great shared space is. So moving on, you can thank a long flight delay for this slide. I think it looks a little bit like one of those magazine ransom notes, but this is a very quick snapshot of the ecosystem of shared spaces. This really is a snapshot of our growing field in Canada, and it spans themes from environment to social enterprise. We have nonprofit co-locations to co-working. I have to add that there are some great logos out there, and I think there's an interesting topic to explore around identity and branding that our shared spaces movement is also moving forward for both the nonprofit and social sectors. So this is a pictorial look at the ecosystem of shared spaces in Canada, and I'm sure we'll be growing that as we go forward. Moving on then to the next set of questions, and maybe I'll just ask Margaret and Sarah if you're tracking the responses and questions, if we had any new centers or contact people identified in the question box. No. Great.
Hi, Lorianne. I'm not seeing new centers particularly, but people are starting to ask questions. And
okay,
I know that it will come up later on in your conversation, but there has been a question about the difference between co-working and shared spaces, and then how do you get to social purpose real estate. So if there's a suitable time to talk about that progression, feel free.
Sure. Great. I'll put a placeholder on that one, and if I don't get to it, just dive in and remind me. Great. So this is on to the next set of questions. In the slides going forward, I'll be giving a very high-level summary of the challenges and opportunities. Whoops, Sarah, could you go back? You identified during the scan. And so as I'm going through this, what we want to hear from you next in the question box is what are the most salient challenges and ideas that you have about moving this work forward. one way I like to frame it is what keeps you up at night and what gets you up in the morning. So some opportunities that resonate with you, and is there a strategy or existing resource that we should add? And so moving to the next slide, the scan walked through the trends shaping the current context in Canada. This is my first Wordle ever, a word cloud. None of these are surprises, but they are important trends influencing charitable giving, collective learning, and even government programming. Ontario 2 weeks ago launched a $4 million social enterprise demonstration fund that's leveraging additional funds from folks like the Community Foundations of Canada. And nearly all of the provinces and territories are investing in the social innovation and social enterprise space. So these are trends that sort of shaped a number of the ideas and strategies and things to think about as we go forward. And a few of them are going to be unpacked in Vancouver as well. So moving on, I call this the googly eyes slide. Here I clustered the opportunities and challenges that I heard from the outreach across the country into 3 broad buckets. Proponent capacity, that is those developing and operating SPREE initiatives, and these are individuals, organizations, collaboratives, they're for-profit, non-profit, hybrid, really anyone who is the who behind the work. Financial capacity obviously is the dollars, but also the ability to access and spend them, and the enabling environment, which is the formal policies and regulations, as well as the informal cultures that hinder or propel shared spaces. Moving forward, I heard so many sincere and rich statements throughout the scan, and I'm sure many of you have said the same things. And one of the most potent revelations a learning community brings is the feeling that I'm not alone. I'm not going to go into detail on the challenges and opportunities. I would encourage you to, if you haven't looked at it already, to take a look at the scan in section 5. This really was the compilation of all of the challenges and ideas I heard from you. I did include some slides that are for information post-webinar. This particular slide again speaks to some of the challenges that people are feeling and often feeling alone about as they're trying to do a social purpose real estate or shared space project, which is, it can be a long, hairy, complex process. And as an aside, if we do start a Canada social purpose real estate network of some kind, I see our Kickstarter campaign selling t-shirts that say, "Failure is not just another day at the office." I really loved that particular quote. The next 2 slides are for information post-webinar. This violates every PowerPoint rule on too much text. And again, the tables in the next few slides do summarize the section 5 of the report. Here I'm just going to report to a headline that people are eager for a mix of free and easy tools and webinars, but what I really heard was a hunger for deeper capacity building. Fellowships, mentoring, sabbaticals, sort of secondments, literally thinking with a leadership lens as we go forward and not just sort of an education and training lens, though there's a lot of interest in that as well. And looking at the next slide, and please do share any thoughts you have on the proponent challenges or ideas that you have to make this work easier. It was also clear from folks that what we need are more resources that are by and for Canadian practitioners or that bridge expertise in other areas. So for example, operations in social housing, could that be better linked to the challenges specific to operating a social purpose building that is a shared space, or even looking across a neighborhood at the collection of community infrastructure we have at the neighborhood level. So the second bucket, moving on to finance. These are sort of iconic representations of what I heard. The first one relates to closing the doors on the church, which is the reality that a lot of bank and financial institutions appear to be skittish when they're supporting nonprofit or social enterprise real estate ventures. Some of the other challenges relate to making collaboration and other things work with rent revenues, the need for pre-development funding and patient capital, as well as a throwdown to us as a community that we need to do a better job of documenting return on investment, and very specific on return on investment. We need to be able to make the financial case. So again, moving to the table, and the PowerPoint will be available afterwards, as is the report. What I found particularly instructive about conversations around finance and funding is that very few people, sort of did the usual call for more government subsidy, although this, of course, did come up. But folks are really positively identifying gaps in the structuring of funds. Again, thinking about the need for pre-development that gets you from beyond the concept idea to schematic drawings and a really solid business plan. Folks are beginning to appreciate and understand that debt is not a four-letter word, but are interested in exploring different types of terms around it, longer time frames, lower interest rates. And I'll mention that throughout the scan, operations did come up as a challenge, and funding operations in particular. And clearly for shared spaces, as well as other social purpose real estate, collaboration is not just an extra. It's part of the DNA. It's part of what makes it successful. It's part of what keeps folks in your building and what keeps folks visiting it. But the secret sauce of collaboration often requires additional funding to buy the ingredients. The rent revenues are often not enough. Moving on to the next slide around enabling environment. And please, again, if any of these issues I've highlighted broadly here resonate with you, or they don't, or there's something else that's keeping you up at night, please feel free to chat it in the question box. This latter bucket, if you will, came out loud and clear in every place I visited. And in shorthand, what I heard was that we simply must overhaul how we plan, support, and sustain community infrastructure to create the kinds of places we want to live. And so on to the next slide, there are definitely practical and realistically long-term change opportunities related to corporate status, tax rules. These often feel very daunting, but I'll note as an example the passage of hybrid corporate statuses, if that's a word, in BC, and I believe coming soon, if not already, in Nova Scotia, is proof that that kind of sticky change can happen. The most salient immediate idea was the idea of local cohorts. Another term I heard were sort of listening tables, and I think the Spree Collaborative itself is a good model. There's interest in people working at a local level, moving beyond just a project level, and trying to use almost a collective impact model of thinking about community infrastructure locally. So moving on to the next slide. Great. Maybe I'll stop here for a second, Margaret, and see if there's any things that folks flagged as opportunities or strategies that they want to make sure we think about.
Well, not surprisingly, there's lots of interest in financing. A couple of related things, obviously long-term financing opportunities. Somebody mentioned in particular that missing that transition period where your initial funding is in place and then you need both financing and expertise for operations. So how do you make that kind of jump? And then also how to get more traditional developers to make the leap to supporting things like a social purpose real estate development in a particular market where there's an identified need. So lots around the financing piece, which resonates with anybody who's undertaken this kind of a project.
That's great. Okay, thank you. And again, today I won't have sort of the wisdom to solve all the problems. We're really trying to surface if a learning community could go forward and what it should focus on. So that's a very good set of issues to focus on. So how best can learning on shared spaces and social purpose real estate be nurtured and scaled? And before we go to the next slide, maybe I'll tackle the earliest question on sort of what the shared spaces are versus social purpose real estate. there's a wonderful diagram that defines shared spaces that I used in the scan, and a shout out to the Center for Social Innovation. If you get any of their publications, Proof, Rigor, that they put together, the sort of case studies, at the very beginning they have definitions of what co-working, shared spaces, community hubs are, and really fabulous graphics to go with it. I am somewhat resistant to defining, co-working is just this, a community hub is this, and the reason I put the logos around a circle and a bit of a spectrum is there's definitely a lot of overlap. There are co-working spaces that are providing office space, for example, to nonprofits. There are nonprofit centers that are home to social enterprises. There's a real opportunity and some exciting examples around comprehensive community revitalization that is in fact thinking about community infrastructure and shared spaces. And in the scan, one of the examples I cited was Regent Park, where you have a Center for Social Innovation, you have Artscape, you have the Daniel Spectrum Learning Center, and this was all literally part of the thinking about revitalizing a social housing community in downtown Toronto. Social purpose real estate is broader, and one of the things I heard from folks, and this was definitely a headline from the scan, is that if we do have a learning community in Canada, we probably shouldn't just limit it to shared spaces, even though there's lots and lots going on, 200 co-working shared spaces. But for example, there's a growing community food centers movement, and it may not be two organizations, it may literally be led by an organization but very active in the community. There's a lot of social enterprises that are losing their spaces. Affordable housing and other types of housing falls broadly within the rubric of social purpose real estate. I think the challenge we'll have thinking about a learning community is how to build on the networks that are already there. I myself work in affordable housing, so we definitely have some exchange and learning infrastructure nationally here in Canada and internationally. There's a lot less out there for other types of social purpose real estate, including as a subset shared space. So again, how best can we nurture and scale this work? So on to the next slide. Yes, some more questions. There's 10 in total, so this is your homework for the webinar. The first one I expect to get a lot of responses for because it's a yes or no question, so that's pretty easy to type. Do you think there is a need for a dedicated pan-Canadian learning community? And feel free to say no, or feel free to say there already is one, we should just make it better or more Canadian. Do you believe there's enough broad-based support? Do you think we could actually build a community and a movement? And then if yes, what role or services should it provide? And I recognize that there's a bit of overlap with the challenges and opportunities piece, but if there's a very precise role or service, please feel free to chat that in. On to the next slide. Great. So to frame what a learning community might look like, I did a dive into over 20 pan-Canadian networks and associations. Some are membership structures, like the Nonprofit Centers Network. Others are sort of affiliate groups, sort of peer groups. And still others are broad social networks, like the Co-working Wiki. These circles represent some of the takeaways and advice, and again, I'm not going to speak to all of them, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Be a Voice refers to the feedback I heard that a national initiative not shy away from rule changes, culture shifts, and tough conversations, advocacy, if you will. The funnel, Start Free, was a very explicit warning I heard from people who run associations as well as others in them, that a fee-based membership model is one of the most fragile we have here in Canada, and that building a movement requires a funnel at which information is open and freely exchanged, and revenue models or paying for services does drill into deeper technical services and support to make projects happen and be sustainable. Interestingly as well, I was really excited. There's a a lot of younger energy. I'm sorry, Sarah, if you could go back, in this movement. Many co-working spaces in particular, but a broad range of buildings and sites I visited are being led by passionate people who, quite frankly, are early stage, so to speak, in their professional and activist lives. I'm a baby boomer, so I can say that. And I did hear that folks don't necessarily buy into sort of a hierarchical committee or membership models. I think it's really exciting, and it's sort of a different way of thinking, that people are eager to be a part of a collective model and contribute. They want to feel like they're contributing to the leadership, that they're part of developing the resources. For those of us who've been members of things for years, that can feel a little bit different, but very exciting. So here's another way to look at it. The two big pillars that I heard are, this is not rocket science, but yes, we do need capacity building on social purpose real estate. I did hear that while there's a lot of great things happening at individual entrepreneur level, the best use of resources might be nonprofits and the social enterprise sector. That can easily be challenged, and feel free to challenge that in the question box. And that there is a need for systems change. That there's an opportunity to ensure that the learning community connects to collective field building. And this again goes to thinking not just about a shared space building, but thinking again about community infrastructure, thinking about the kinds of civic assets we want to have in our community. So I took a crack at framing these two pillars as goals. In the next slide, the goal of a learning community could be to grow the capacity of practitioners who are imagining, implementing, and scaling social purpose real estate. A couple of the tidbits of advice was, work from a coalition of the willing and get going and make it, again, sort of fun and easy to participate. Some of the short-term, literally sort of 6 months to a year kind of quick wins were an interactive atlas, literally just getting people to express interest in a learning community and continuing the conversation. Obviously, there's opportunities like Vancouver face-to-face, but a number of people just said, let's talk. The low-tech idea of phone calls of the willing. The second goal relates again to the field building. There's definitely traction behind the idea of local tables, and I'll give a shout out to my friends in Edmonton, a focus group that we had that kind of generated the idea of kind of a local cohort approach to thinking about community infrastructure. And again, I think the Social Purpose Real Estate Collaborative is a great model. I know there have been meetings in the GTA in Ontario. So is there a way that a learning community could provide some of the guidance, the templates, the facilitation to help grow a bit of a sort of a necklace of local cohorts and tables? I did hear that some of this work might best focus on place-based work, say at the level of a municipality or neighborhood. As we all know, just having meetings to sort of coordinate and talk doesn't usually have the same potency as meeting to unstick a barrier on the ground or really drive forward a tangible opportunity like a building or a civic asset like a school that may be closing down. So finally, moving to the options. I came up with 3 options. I call them straw men. They're intended to spur discussion. They share one critical assumption based on what I heard loud and clear in my outreach. And this is, again, that shared space, while an important model and one that has some unique aspects to it, is really too narrow a focus to scale learning and build support for community infrastructure here in Canada. So these options all reflect a broader focus on social purpose real estate. The first option is the idea of coordinating through a loose network of networks, sort of using what's already on the ground here in Canada, working with intermediaries like MARS, the Nonprofit Centers Network, the Community Forward Fund. We have a number of practitioners providing technical support outside of their own projects. Could we begin to just have conversations and do this in a organic and fairly low-cost way. A sample model, and again, Russ from Edmonton, is the Federation of Voluntary Sector Organizations. They use calls and then host an in-person meeting with their counterparts. The challenge here, again, is that it'll probably remain more at an information level, information sharing level, rather than moving the needle on field building itself. And of course, this can be a challenging way to kind of create a collective voice. The second option is to think about affiliating a Canadian network within an existing organization. NCN is on the call. They're growing Canadian members, but don't really yet have homegrown content and on-the-ground support. There are others working in social enterprise and in housing. This is what I heard was told to me as sort of don't reinvent the wheel option, and I think that's always wise advice. That said, the sort of challenges with this particular option is that it might not get to the level of love and care that I heard practitioners would like, and given the interest in sort of community building and advocacy, some folks felt it was clear to have a network or an initiative that was robust enough to be a go-to on-the-ground leader. The third option is the sort of full-scale thinking around a pan-Canadian Centre for Social Purpose Real Estate. It could also be nested in another larger institution, but here the idea was a think, do, tank kind of model that functions as a hub for exchange, research, best practice, and constructive engagement. This is the most resource-intensive option. Two precedents mentioned to me were Mars Centre for Impact Investment and the Community Food Centres Canada movement that has started. Interestingly, both have direct overlap with social purpose real estate. So moving to the next slide. What next? We want to hear from you. I like to say, is there a there? And we want to think about the if, why, and what of a pan-Canadian strategy on social purpose real estate. The next 6 months, continued feedback, revisions, and suggestions on the scan, and as part of that, again, continued documentation of who's out there. There is a lot of interest in the kind of interactive atlas, for example. Continued outreach. My email will be on the last slide, and Margaret and I are dying to hear from you, and we would potentially follow up with 1 or 2 coordinating calls if folks are interested. And then continuing the conversation, we definitely will be doing that at the Building Opportunities in Vancouver, and we've set ourselves a bit of a date of that time frame of June of thinking about a go or no go. Is there a there? And if there is, let's roll. Let's get folks together and think of some next steps. So to end, our last few questions. And again, feel free to chat them in. Do you have a preferred option? And it may be none of the above, none of the 3 I mentioned. Be explicit about who and where you think a learning community could be positioned. If you're not comfortable sharing that on the questions publicly, you can do that privately to us. And again, as a reminder, I'll be compiling all this in a Google Doc that I'll share, so you'll have some time to chew and add into that too. How would your organization be able to support a pan-Canadian initiative? How many times have we said, oh yeah, we'd like to do this, and then at the end of the day, folks don't, come, there's no resources, so we want to hear if there's something you actually do want to contribute. And how would you like to stay involved in the conversation? So feel free to chat in your responses, and I'm going to stop here and Margaret ask you to summarize or point out anything you've seen in the responses already, anything provocative, anything exciting.
Sure. Well, we had a flurry of comments and questions in respect of the preceding question set. The obvious question is, how can a national network help remove barriers, educate, help broker relationships? And some of the things that people mentioned that would be good about a national network, everybody needs to know what the tax rules are, the business rules, People, are not interested, obviously, in just dialogues and reports, and as we're used to seeing in all kinds of spheres in Canada, people are interested in the regional representation. So even a chapter in a province would help reduce duplication, within that provincial boundary. But a number of people mentioned, having some kind of regional understanding that feeds into perhaps a more national perspective. Somebody mentioned, Tracy Boyer mentioned Startup Canada as a good one to look at when we're thinking about pan-Canadian versus a regional approach to things. And a couple of other people made good suggestions of organizations that have managed to be pan-Canadian in a more successful kind of way. Lots of enthusiasm in the initial years for almost anything, as we know, and the trick, of course, is to ensure that it remains sustainable in future years. And a suggestion that there might be something that's required in the beginning to get started that might look very different later on, and that might feed into it being more sustainable over the years as well. Questions around people are interested in knowing. So that's sort of the big picture that you've been asking here. But if we look back at some of the pieces of this, people are perhaps a little more familiar with specializing around housing or co-working, but they're also wondering about things where it's more of a mashup. And is there some way to look at what does it take to be successful when you're putting together things that are a little less disparate, perhaps, in their underlying purpose. And that speaks as well to somebody else's question about, when you get all these different people or organizations engaged, how do you make the decisions between people's different ideas of, what's a priority? A couple of other things, just on a specialization note. Somebody asked whether anybody knows anything about spaces around agriculture, which I thought was an interesting question. And a number of people hinted around that, it seems that around the arts there's reasonable momentum in different ways and spaces, but that it's a little harder to generate sort of funder interest and other kinds of interest around spaces that are non-arts related.
Interesting. I'm sure my peers in the arts world might not always agree about the resources. I love the idea of the mashup, and that's definitely sort of something I observed and saw. And I think that again speaks to being a little bit fluid, and that the idea of social purpose real estate for me is a wonderful kind of framing and definition, because it does allow for not sort of pinning things down rigidly, but puts forward front and center social purpose. So it may look different in different communities. And I'd also just respond, I very much heard the regional piece when I was out there, and that one of the ways I framed it in the scan was that pan-Canadian does not necessarily mean national, that people often relate to each other differently, and that it can be very local, it can be very regional, and that includes regional into the U.S. I heard that folks in Vancouver learn from San Francisco, not so much from Toronto. I heard that folks are very keen to connect across like communities, small towns, rural hubs, and I heard that there is a need to think about inclusion. And interestingly enough, the look at associations in my conversations said, that can be a very challenging strategy. A lot of times folks really try to structure it. But that what really works is much more culture, that any kind of national or pan-Canadian group is truly open and accessible, because even though you can have the formal delegate representing First Nations, Aboriginal communities, that's often not good enough, that you really need to sort of have the ground up meet the kind of pan-Canadian side. So. No answers yet, but I'm thrilled by all of the interest. Any other questions or thoughts? Margaret, I do have one for you that I just saw on Tides Canada and what your role is in all this.
Well, just a general interest across the country. We are a national charity. We operate about 40 projects across the country on a shared services basis, and by its nature, shared services and shared spaces go together. So we have an opportunity to be engaged in different ways around this work, and then work quite intensively with the Shared Purpose Real Estate Collaborative in Vancouver. They did a conference initially in 2010, which was tremendously well received, and it really indicated great appetite and need, and so we thought we might be able to be a bit of a facilitator to bring people together to look at this question to see is there some way to help move this forward so that all these great things that are happening in spaces around Canada can learn from each other rather than us all having to recreate the wheel. So it was an opportunity that was there. We have various colleagues who are interested in moving it forward, and so we decided to take that on last year.
Great.
And Lorianne, I wanted to just jump in.
It's always so difficult because we're trying to be interactive and it's just you and me on the phone.
Lorianne, I'd like to jump in. This is Sarah.
Absolutely.
I wanted to give, I've been reading all the questions as well, and a little bit of what is ahead for NCN. As everyone can start to understand, we are firmly rooted in the origins of shared space, but we have increasingly viewed ourselves as within the larger umbrella of social purpose real estate. So that really matches what Lorianne was talking about the field, and we are partnering with the Social Purpose Real Estate Roundtable in Vancouver to do our conference jointly. So the conference will have lots of topics on shared space and then those larger umbrella aspects of the field, which are sometimes universal, sometimes there are a lot of unique pieces about these two parts of the field. I would say that the Nonprofit Centers Network has participated in this scan, and we have mobilized our network to support this scan, and of course the scan was broader than just our network. But our network has been really keen on this, and our board will take a lot of these findings, and we're talking about our next steps and how we move forward, and we want to be responsive to our Canadian members, but also to the larger community. So if there's a role for us that we could play, we are eager to do it, and we're eager to keep listening and learning about the unique considerations and circumstances in Canada.
Thanks. I'm looking at the questions as well, and there is some divergence of view. Some people like, not another one. This might create silos, and other folks are definitely interested in. I think a couple of the questions I saw as well that stuck out, and this relates to the funding. I don't have an answer, and this would probably not be the next 6 months, but how do we use scale for attracting financial resources for this work? And I know this is a question that gets folks at the Mars Center for Impact Investing and other folks up every day, which is, there are resources out there. There's a growing field in impact investment. There's great resources like the Community Forward Fund, but is there a potential value add going forward for this kind of something squarely in Canada that can also begin to fill some of the financing gaps and challenges we heard? Again, no answers. What we really want to do is think about the next steps. Margaret, were there any recommendations on if folks want to stay involved in the conversation and what we might do next?
Sure. Some interesting ideas. I'm looking at one from Tom Bushell, and apologies if I've pronounced your name incorrectly, Tom, that each of the 200 shared space organizations that you found in your scan invested $100 each a year. There you'd have the money for the Pan-Canadian organization. And so yes, a number of people have indicated that they'd like to stay involved. And I think that that's part of what we want to try and figure out as a central locus for this activity. Lorianne is going to do a Google Docs of the questions that we've received here. And somebody had mentioned that they weren't able to see the questions, and so that may be the case for everybody. And just to let people know that Lorianne will compile the questions and who the participants have been and share it in this Google Doc with everybody who's participated and some folks in the broader community who were part of being interviewed and that sort of thing. Everybody's interested in understanding how we would, find the seed funding to move forward. I mean, people are always asking that question. It's always what we end up with. But people are looking forward to some particular conversations, I think, with you, Lorianne, and also some more general things at the conference and with perhaps another webinar.
Sarah, can you move to the last slide so people can get my contact information? And then I do see a question on the Canadian-U.S. context. And of course, that's a question near and dear to my heart. I've had a few people call me a double agent. I'm an American in the process of getting my permanent residency here in Canada. And I actually came to social purpose real estate by doing the concept work behind the Nonprofit Center building in Boston, the Third Sector New England building in Boston. That Third Sector is actually also the fiscal sponsor for the Nonprofit Centers Network. So it comes full circle. I'm kind of, I think, unique in that I started with shared spaces and community infrastructure, and then I went into affordable housing. I think one of the differences we have here in Canada is that a lot of folks sort of doing this work may have started in the social housing sector, whereas in the U.S. Sort of there's probably a bit of a longer history, including with groups like the Nonprofit Finance Fund around nonprofit infrastructure in particular. There's definitely, I did hear loud and clear that there are some real challenges that we have here in Canada, and again, finance, tax rules, just practical challenges. We are a very large country as well, so thinking about kind of communities of practice and thinking a bit more regionally. Making sure we think about First Nation and Aboriginal communities inclusion came up very clearly. I think the other interesting thing for me, and it's hard to know if this was an issue of time or if it's a difference between our countries, but when we founded the Nonprofit Centers Network, I guess how many years, 15 years ago or something, many of us were coming squarely from the nonprofit sector and thinking about the cost savings, the benefits of collaboration as nonprofit organizations. What I think it was exciting for me doing the scan, and I don't know if this is distinctly Canadian or not, but it sure felt good, is that there's a lot more thinking about placemaking, and I see that Tim Jones is on the call, and our Scape has been such a leader in thinking about creative placemaking and the role of arts and culture. But the reason that the idea for thinking about kind of a community of practice around community infrastructure came up is that people are thinking about the impact of these kinds of projects on places and where they live. We were a little more insular when we started a few years ago, thinking about how can we support the nonprofit sector, how can we serve our clients better, and those are often still important missions and drivers for co-locations and nonprofit centers. But there's a lot of thinking in Canada as we face less government subsidy and things about thoughtful and sustainable civic infrastructure, and I think that's exciting. I wouldn't say that's an entire difference from the U.S., but it's something that certainly I saw as an opportunity to think about a learning community so that you can connect a little bit of local thinking around community infrastructure with the kind of capacity buildings. Don't know if that answered that question. So again, some practical differences, but also some really interesting opportunities.
Great. I had a couple of more things, Lorianne.
Or words of wisdom you want to have to close us out?
Yeah, I was going to say that people had mentioned both the private sector and government, that understanding how to get and keep them involved is important, and particularly with the push to entrepreneurialism that all of the not-for-profit sector is feeling. Clever ways to include the private sector in this work is going to be important pieces moving forward. And just a little sort of encouragement to everyone who's on the call. Tracy at the Halifax Hub mentioned that, that the space provider themselves, it's hard to provide this space free, but finding a sponsor for the space and is perhaps an option. And so I think to get this a little bit on the road, everybody thinking about what piece could they provide, what thing could they offer up, so that we can think about what are the elements that we can tap into that people can actually manage to move forward. I mean, if you look at a price tag of $100,000 or $200,000, everybody shies away. But are there little pieces that everybody can do to make this more effective moving forward?
Great.
So that's the minutia, and the bigger picture of getting government and private sector involved, a big different way of acting. So I think there's a whole spectrum of work that we can do, and Tides Canada looks forward to being remaining part of the conversation with so many other people with great ideas, as we have seen on these questions.
Great. Well, I look forward to hearing from everyone, and we'll definitely get the Google Doc up. And Sarah, I'll let you sign us out. Thank you so much. I just have to thank everyone again. I was so well received everywhere I went during the scan, and I'm so thrilled to see so many people on the call and giving candid and direct feedback. So I think there is a there, and I really look forward to working with you to get there.
Yes, I would just say someone wrote in that Lorianne Gervin is a great asset, and we agree. And so I want to thank Lorianne for doing this, and of course Margaret Dixon and Tides Canada for supporting this great work in Canada. And NCN remains an active participant and wants to continue in this conversation as well, and we'll be doing that with you all in Vancouver. We hope to see you there. So this is us signing off, and you'll have we'll be sending out the slides as a follow-up. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.